they never taught us the real reason Appalachian hunters survived where others starved. We tell the story of rifles and knives, hatchets and traps, and that's part of it. But the weapons that actually kept mountain families alive through the cruelest winters weren't the ones hanging on cabin walls. They were the ones nobody talks about. They were the weapons of deception, improvisation, and knowing when not to kill at all. Today, we're uncovering the survival strategies Appalachian hunters actually relied on. The hidden knowledge passed down in whispers, recorded in scattered letters, and buried in oral histories that contradict everything the popular narrative tells you. These weren't the flashy weapons of frontier legend. These were the practical, sometimes brutal, and deeply clever methods that separated those who fed their families from those who died in their cabins come April. The biggest misconception about Appalachian hunters was that they were constantly hunting. That's wrong, dead wrong. The real survivors knew something modern hunters, even experienced outdoorsmen, still don't understand. Hunting big game consumed enormous amounts of energy, required ammunition or arrows you might not have, and took time you couldn't always spare. The frontier families who thrived weren't the ones obsessed with dropping a 12-point buck. They were the ones who mastered low-energy food acquisition. They were the ones who understood that sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't speed or force. It was patience combined with systematic abundance. The hunting journals we've recovered from Virginia and Kentucky collections tell a surprising story. Between the entries about rifle kills and trap furs, there are references to stone weirs, fish runs, berry camps, and something called trap rotation by our system, so ingenious that one family in eastern Kentucky documented feeding 9 people for 8 months on less ammunition than a modern deer hunter uses in a single season. They weren't living off luck. They were living off strategy. Let's start with a weapon that changed everything for mountain families. One that historians have almost completely forgotten. It's not a knife or a rifle or even something you'd recognize as a weapon. But from 1790 to 1920, it kept more people alive in the southern Appalachian region than any firearm ever did. The stoneware was engineering that required zero ammunition, could be maintained by children and elderly family members, and produced a completely predictable yield of food week after week without ever requiring you to step foot in dangerous winter hunting grounds. A weir was a carefully constructed stone barrier built across a shallow creek, designed to funnel fish into a contained area where they could be harvested with gigs, nets, or even bare hands during spawning seasons. What made them brilliant wasn't the concept. Native Americans had been using them for centuries. What made them revolutionary for mountain families was the sustainability principle. A Cherokee weir built in 1750 in the Hiwassee River Valley could still be producing fish in 1850, requiring almost no maintenance beyond clearing debris after spring floods. The knowledge of where to build them, the specific pools where fish congregated, the precise angles that created the funneling effect was worth more than any map. But here's where it gets interesting. These weirs weren't just fishing structures, they were weapons of resource monopoly. A family that controlled multiple weirs on a creek system controlled the food supply for miles around. They could trade dried fish, they could negotiate peace, and they could survive lean years when game animals migrated or were hunted out. Frontier records from North Carolina show situations where families with established weir systems actually became wealthier and more politically influential than families with larger land claims. The second weapon they never talk about was the understanding of timing and migration cycles. Not just for the animals, but for the plants. The calendar of an Appalachian survival expert wasn't divided into months. It was divided into specific biological events. Each week of the year had a name tied to what was ready to harvest or hunt. Contemporary accounts from the 1860s describe elderly hunters who could predict to within 3 days when hickory nuts would drop, when migrating turkey flocks would pass through specific gaps in the mountains, when fish would begin their spawning runs, and when the first frosts would bring deer down from the high ridges. This wasn't mysticism. This was applied biological knowledge, accumulated through multiple generations and encoded into family tradition. One family manuscript from West Virginia actually contained what amounted to a weekly hunting and gathering calendar for the entire year. April was trout time. Mid-May was morel season. Late June was early berry time, followed by peak berry time in early July. August was hickory time. October was a corn and chestnut time. November was root season for deer. December was winter trapping time. Each season had not just one food source, but multiple overlapping sources that provided redundancy. The brilliance was that they weren't dependent on any single kill or harvest. If the deer season was poor, they had fish. If fish populations crashed, they had nuts and berries and trapped fur-bearing animals. If winters were harsh enough that small game migrated south, they had stored nuts and dried preserved fish and meat from the fall. This system-based approach to survival meant that actual starvation was preventable, manageable, and only happened when families were displaced or cut off from their territories. The third weapon was something we'd call controlled scarcity. Families with knowledge, and this is crucial, actively managed their hunting territories to prevent overexploitation. They would deliberately not hunt in certain areas during certain seasons. They would rotate their hunting grounds on multi-year cycles. They understood that if you trap out the beaver in your creek valley one year, you need to let it recover for 3 years before you trap it again. This sounds obvious to modern conservation-minded people, but in the context of frontier America, where the dominant survival strategy was take everything, move west when it runs out, this was radical. It was a weapon because it guaranteed long-term abundance in an era when most frontier regions were experiencing rapid environmental collapse. A valley with a family that practiced rotation hunting was guaranteed to produce food indefinitely. A valley where multiple families showed up with rifles and traps and no restraint was depleted within a decade. Historical records from what became Tennessee and Kentucky describe repeated incidents where migrating families arrived in valleys expecting abundant game and found them stripped bare. Some of these valleys had been occupied by the same family for decades and maintained surprising productivity. Others had seen 3 or 4 different families pass through in 10 years, each taking everything they could carry. The difference wasn't geography or luck, it was knowledge and discipline. The fourth weapon was the deliberate cultivation of non-lethal food sources that required zero weapons at all. Root vegetables, greens, berries, and nuts were managed almost like domestic crops. Families would deliberately plant useful species near their cabins, not through formal gardening, but through seed dispersal and subtle environmental management. They would burn forest areas to promote growth of berry-producing plants. They would dig out root vegetables and transplant them closer to the homestead. One surviving account from a botanist in the 1880s described his shock at finding what appeared to be a wild berry patch in a remote mountain cove. Hundreds of bushes producing massive crops of berries spread in a pattern that revealed deliberate human management. The family living there claimed the berries had always been there, but the botanist recognized it as managed landscape. The family had probably been maintaining and expanding that berry patch for 3 generations without ever formally planting it. This is crucial to understanding Appalachian survival because it shifts the narrative completely. These families weren't living off the land through constant combat with wilderness. They were living with the land through understanding, patience, and active management. The weapon was knowledge of how to modify their environment in subtle ways that increased food production without requiring formal agriculture. The fifth weapon was something called partnership hunting. Right. And this is where things get genuinely interesting from a tactical standpoint. Modern hunting tends to be individualistic. One hunter, one rifle, one kill. Appalachian hunters often operated in coordinated groups with highly specialized roles, and this gave them advantages that a solo hunter could never achieve. One account from a Kentucky journal describes a deer hunt that involved 11 men. This wasn't a recreational outing. This was a military operation. 2 men moved ahead as drivers to scare deer toward a kill zone. 3 men positioned themselves at known escape routes with rifles. 2 men watched high ground areas where wounded deer might flee. 3 men prepared the processing area with water and tools. 1 man served as coordinator and made final decisions about which deer to pursue and which to let pass. The efficiency was devastating. In a single coordinated hunt, a group like this could reliably harvest 4 to 6 deer with minimal ammunition waste and near guaranteed kills. The meat was immediately processed, the hide was handled expertly, and nothing was wasted. A solo hunter doing the same task might take weeks and use 3 times the ammunition trying different approaches. But the deeper level of this weapon was the social structure it created. Men who could coordinate a successful hunt held tremendous status. Knowledge of how to rid deer behavior and predict movement was valuable enough that experienced hunters could essentially demand respect and resources from less experienced families. A man who could teach you how to hunt effectively in your specific local territory was more valuable than a man with the finest rifle in the county. This created a system where was actively protected and transmitted through mentorship rather than through writing or public teaching. A father taught his sons. A successful hunter took on apprentices. Family relationships and alliances were strengthened through shared hunting knowledge. And families that isolated themselves, that refused to share or trade knowledge, were systematically excluded from the best hunting grounds and left at a massive disadvantage. The sixth weapon was something they called sign reading, and it was more sophisticated than modern hunters typically understand. It wasn't just tracking animals, it was reading the entire story of a landscape, knowing what animals had passed through, when they had passed, how many there were, what their condition was, and what they were doing. This information allowed hunters to predict where animals would be before they ever went out to hunt. A skilled sign reader could walk through a forest for an hour and construct a complete picture of the animals in the area, which direction the deer had come from, how recently they had passed, what they were feeding on, whether they were stressed or calm, which way they were headed, and even which specific animals they were by analyzing slight variations in track size and gait. This information was worth more than a rifle because it turned hunting from a game of chance into a game of certainty. One remarkable account from an 1870s hunting journal describes a hunter named Thomas Garrett from eastern Kentucky who could look at a series of deer tracks and tell you not just the sex and age of the deer, but also whether it was healthy or injured, whether it was likely to be calm or nervous, what time of day it had passed, and even what weather was coming by observing how the tracks were holding fresh mud versus dust-filled tracks, indicating completely different moisture conditions. But the real sophistication came from understanding that animals themselves were reading signs and that hunters needed to be constantly aware of what signs they were leaving. The weapon wasn't just reading the forest. It was being invisible in the forest, leaving only signs that animals interpreted as non-threatening. This required understanding wind direction, understanding how animals perceived sound and movement, understanding what paths animals naturally traveled and which routes they avoided. The seventh weapon was the understanding of poison and paralytic plants, knowledge that's so effectively suppressed in historical records that most people don't even realize it was a factor in frontier survival. Arrow poisons, plant-based medicines, and various botanical preparations that could be applied to weapons or used to incapacitate animals were part of the knowledge base of experienced hunters. This isn't theory. Early colonial accounts and later frontier journals contain careful descriptions of arrow poisons derived from specific plants, particular preparation techniques, and the time required for the poison to achieve effect. Some poisons were fast-acting but required precise application. Others were slower but more reliable. The most sophisticated formulations could apparently be adjusted for strength, depending on the size of the animal you were hunting. Now, before this triggers any modern alarm bells, this knowledge was actively suppressed by authorities and essentially disappeared from written records by the mid-1800s. But its presence in earlier accounts tells us something crucial about what Appalachian hunters actually knew. A hunter with knowledge of plant-based preparations could disable or kill an animal with a single arrow or dart, requiring no sound, minimal physical damage to the animal, and the ability to execute a kill from impressive distances with weapons that made almost no noise. The suppression of this knowledge is itself revealing. As formal European-style settlements increased in Appalachia and governmental authority expanded, knowledge that was too effective, too efficient, and too hard to police was actively discouraged. Authorities wanted hunters to use firearms they could regulate, track, and control. Botanical knowledge was too distributed, too hard to monitor, and too powerful in the hands of independent families. The eighth weapon was something we might call trap intelligence. Not just setting traps, but understanding where animals would step, how they moved through a landscape, and designing trap systems that worked with animal behavior rather than against it. Appalachian trappers didn't randomly scatter traps across territory. They constructed trap lines with sophisticated understanding of animal movement patterns. A trap line in a mountainous region might have traps placed at specific locations that took advantage of natural funneling effects. Steep terrain where animals naturally concentrated, ridge lines they preferred to cross, water crossing, where options were limited. The most sophisticated trap systems used multiple traps set at different spacing and configured for different objectives. One trap might be designed to kill, another to capture alive, others to simply capture an animal's leg so the trapper would know an animal had passed. By analyzing which traps had been sprung and which hadn't, a skilled trapper could construct a complete picture of animal movement without ever laying eyes on the animals themselves. What made this effective as a survival weapon was that it required almost no ongoing input once established. A trap line could be maintained by a boy of 12 or 13. An elderly person who could no longer keep up with active hunting could maintain a trap line. A family could operate multiple trap lines in different areas simultaneously, creating redundant food production systems. The ninth weapon was controlled fire, the deliberate and careful use of fire to manage the landscape, promote growth of useful plants, reduce dangerous brush, and create conditions favorable to game animals. This is understated to the point of invisibility in most historical accounts, but it was absolutely essential to frontier survival. Appalachian families understood that regular, small fires in specific areas could maintain open woodland, the kind of habitat that supported browse for deer, space for traveling, and reduced dangerous fuel loads. Some areas were burned every 2 to 3 years, others were left to grow wild. The pattern was deliberate and created a mosaic of different habitat types across the landscape. Colonial and early American records describe indigenous peoples using similar techniques, and frontier observers noted that forests that had been regularly burned by indigenous peoples were park-like open, easy to travel through, full of game. As European settlements increased and indigenous burning practices were suppressed, forests became denser and harder to hunt in. Game populations crashed, not just because animals were hunted, but because their habitat was degraded by the suppression of fire. Appalachian families that maintained the knowledge and practice of controlled burning preserved habitat quality and maintained game populations in areas where other families' territories were collapsing into unusable forest. This was less visible than killing a deer, but it was probably more important to long-term survival. Now, here's something you'll want to understand more deeply because it connects all of these survival weapons together. The families that thrived weren't the ones with the most guns or the sharpest knives. They were the ones with the most comprehensive knowledge systems. A family that understood weir construction, seasonal migration, sign reading, trap placement, controlled burning, partnership hunting, and landscape management wasn't surviving. They were thriving. They could generate surplus, trade with neighboring families, and weather years when conditions were difficult. If you're genuinely interested in the specific knowledge that made this possible, the techniques that are almost entirely lost to modern historical records, there's a much deeper analysis available for you in the description and in the pinned comment. This is knowledge that was deliberately obscured and suppressed, and it's been reconstructed from fragments of journals, oral histories, and careful analysis of what the landscape actually tells us about how it was managed. The 10th weapon brings us to something most people find genuinely shocking when they first encounter it: the practice of intentional non-lethal predation management. Appalachian hunters didn't just focus on prey animals. They systematically managed predator populations to ensure that the prey animals they depended on remained abundant. Wolves, bears, and cougars were killed in Appalachia, not as a side effect of hunting, but as a deliberate management strategy. A valley with an active predator population saw its deer and elk populations suppressed. A valley where predators had been eliminated or reduced saw wild game populations increase. Frontier hunters understood this ecological relationship and acted on it systematically. The evidence is unmistakable in settlement records. Areas that eliminated predators quickly developed abundant game. Areas that left predators alone experienced persistent problems with game scarcity. Hunters tracked and killed predators with the same care and coordination they used on prey animals, understanding that the success of their hunting system depended on managing the entire ecosystem. This is radically different from the common narrative of wilderness conquest or brave hunters fighting dangerous predators. It was ecological management. It was recognizing that humans were part of a system, and that system required active maintenance to serve human needs. It was sophisticated, it was effective, and it was implemented systematically across Appalachia. The 11th weapon was something that gets almost no historical attention despite being absolutely essential: the understanding of water systems and seasonal water availability. Survival in dry environments depends on finding water. Survival in Appalachia was different, but the principle applied. Families that controlled reliable water sources controlled the landscape. Mountain families deliberately located their cabins near reliable water sources and understood the seasonal patterns of every water system in their territory. They knew which springs ran year-round and which dried up in summer. They knew which creeks flooded in spring and which could be crossed almost any time. They knew where water pooled in drought years and where animals would concentrate during dry seasons. But more than that, they understood how water systems connected. They knew that a small creek running low might be fed by hidden sources further uphill. They knew that trapped water could be found in rocky outcrops and depressions. They knew how to dig shallow wells that would produce water even in dry years. They understood water as a resource to be managed like food production. One family living in a particularly dry mountain area in North Carolina reportedly maintained three separate water sources: a spring near their cabin, a well they had hand dug, and a constructed cistern that captured rain from their roof and from runoff. This redundancy meant they never had to walk more than a few hundred yards for water, even in years when regional droughts occurred. Families without this level of preparation sometimes had to relocate during severe droughts. The 12th weapon was the mastery of food preservation, not as a technical process, but as a production system. Smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, and storage in root cellars weren't just techniques. They were strategic tools that determined whether a family could convert seasonal abundance into year-round survival. A family that could preserve meat effectively during the fall hunting season could convert that abundance into food that lasted until the next hunting season. A family that couldn't preserve food effectively would find itself hungry in March and April, no matter how successful the fall hunt had been. The preservation technology was simple, but mastering the specific conditions, timing, and techniques required experience across multiple seasons. The most sophisticated families didn't just preserve food. They understood that different preservation techniques produced different properties. Smoked meat lasted longer, but tasted different than salted meat. Dried meat was the most shelf-stable, but had different texture and nutritional properties. Fermented foods provided specific vitamin values that fresh or cooked foods didn't. They mixed preservation techniques to create dietary diversity throughout the year. The 13th weapon connected directly to preserving food, the salt source. In regions where salt deposits weren't nearby, families traveled significant distances to salt licks or coastal areas to procure salt. In Appalachia, some families positioned themselves near salt sources or maintained access to trade networks that brought salt to them. Salt wasn't just seasoning. It was a preservative that extended the shelf life of meat indefinitely. The scarcity of salt created an economy. Families that had reliable salt supplies could preserve meat that families without salt couldn't. They could trade preserved meat, which increased their status and influence. They could command resources from families that needed salt. In some regions, salt was valuable enough that families jealously guarded their salt sources and viewed them almost as military assets. The 14th weapon was understanding the properties of different animals and using that knowledge to optimize hunting strategies. A bear was different from a deer, which was different from a wild boar, which was different from a turkey. Each animal had different behavior, different reaction patterns, different meat quality, and different utility for hides and bones. Families specialized. Some became known as the best bear hunters in the region. Others specialized in turkey hunting. Others were famous for their success with wild hogs. This specialization made them valuable to their communities because they could supply specific resources that other families couldn't reliably produce. A family known for excellent bear hunting could trade bear grease and fur hides for other resources they didn't produce themselves. Understanding bear behavior meant knowing that bears in certain seasons were aggressive and required different tactics than bears in other seasons. Understanding deer meant knowing that the behavior of bucks in rut was completely different from does with fawns. Understanding hogs meant knowing that wounded hogs were extraordinarily dangerous and required coordinated, careful hunting. The knowledge also included understanding how to differentiate the quality of animals. A family with expertise could look at an animal and determine its age, health status, and meat quality before committing to a hunt. A young, healthy deer was worth pursuing. An old animal with signs of disease might not be worth the effort. The 15th weapon was the development of expertise in processing and using every part of an animal. This wasn't waste reduction, it was a production system. A deer provided meat, but also hides for clothing and shelter, sinew for thread and bowstrings, bones for tools and needles, and even the bladder for water storage. Mountain families operate like small factories, nothing left untouched. A single animal might feed a family for weeks and provide materials that lasted months. This systematic approach meant that successful hunting wasn't just about finding game. It was about understanding the entire cycle of use and preservation that sustained life through winter. The 14th weapon in our countdown brings us to something many people overlook entirely, the tobacco knife. Now, this wasn't about addiction or recreation. In Appalachia, tobacco was currency, it was trade goods, it was survival insurance. The tobacco knife had a distinctive shape, a broad blade that curved slightly, designed specifically for harvesting the leaves without bruising them. Bruised tobacco brought lower prices at market, and families who understood this understood the difference between eating well that winter and going hungry. Mountain farmers could harvest an acre in a day with a good tobacco knife, working in rows under brutal August heat. The tool taught precision. You couldn't hack at tobacco. You had to understand the plant, where the leaf connected, how to remove it without tearing. That same precision, that same respect for materials translated directly to hunting. A man who could harvest tobacco carefully could stalk game patiently. The cognitive skills overlap completely. But here's what makes the tobacco knife fascinating from a weapons perspective. When necessity called, it became something else entirely. In disputes, in fights that erupted in hollows far from law enforcement, the tobacco knife was at hand. It was legal to carry, it was practical. But in trained hands, it was devastating. The curve of the blade could slash, or thrust. The weight gave it impact. Frontier records from the 1800s describe altercations where tobacco knives featured prominently. Not because they were designed as weapons, but because they were the implements men carried every day. The 13th weapon on our list is often dismissed as pure folklore, but the evidence suggests otherwise: the blowgun. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, particularly in areas with strong Cherokee influence, men crafted blowguns from hollowed cane or elder wood. These weren't the exotic weapons of rainforest hunters. They were practical tools adapted to mountain hunting. A cane blowgun 3 to 4 feet long, crafted carefully so the bore was straight and true, could take squirrels and small game silently. That silence was the advantage. The ammunition came from anywhere. Wasp nests provided paper for wadding. Lead could be melted and cast into tiny pellets, or sharpened bone points could be fashioned in an hour. Poison came from plants that grew wild in the mountains. Not deadly poisons necessarily, but substances that made small game drowsy or docile enough to dispatch cleanly. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic records both support that blowguns persisted in the mountains well into the 1900s, particularly among families that maintained cultural continuity with indigenous practices. Why would a hunter use a blowgun when he had rifles? Because ammunition cost money. Because he might be hunting in an area where gunfire would alert game over a wide radius. Because the skill required to master a blowgun developed focus and lung capacity that served him in other ways. And because sometimes in the deep hollows where supply lines barely reached, a blowgun was the only viable option available. The 12th weapon represents something that rarely appears in historical accounts, but was absolutely essential: the trained dog. Not just any dog, but hunting dogs specifically bred and trained for mountain conditions. The mountain feist was small, rarely weighing more than 30 pounds, but incredibly intelligent and relentless. These dogs could track a scent through laurel thickets where a man would be cut to pieces within minutes. They could corner game without being ordered. They understood the mountain terrain like no human could. A man with a good face could hunt territory that would be impossible alone. The dog's intelligence meant it could learn specific commands, not just attack or retrieve, but complex instructions about which game to pursue, which to ignore, how to respond to different situations. Families with especially good hunting dogs guarded them carefully. A feist could be stolen or die of injury, and replacing that years-long relationship and training wasn't quick or cheap. Mountain families sometimes traveled considerable distances to breed their dogs with proven stock, understanding that genetics and training combine to create irreplaceable assets. The 11th weapon in our countdown is something many modern people wouldn't recognize as a weapon at all: the deadfall trap. This was a mechanical system of extraordinary cleverness. A heavy log balanced on a trigger mechanism positioned above a trail where game would pass. When an animal touched or tripped the trigger, the log fell, killing or immobilizing the prey. The engineering required serious thought. The log had to be heavy enough to be effective. The trigger mechanism had to be sensitive enough to respond to an animal's weight, but sturdy enough not to misfire from wind or small creatures. A skilled trapper could construct a deadfall in 30 minutes with nothing but an axe and knowledge. Some families maintained trap lines with dozens of deadfalls, checking them daily. A single successful deadfall might provide meat that fed the family for 2 days or more. The trap required no ammunition, no noise, no active hunting. You set it and continued other work. It was passive income in the form of protein. And the knowledge of where to place a trap, understanding animal behavior, trail systems, the terrain, was as valuable as the ability to shoot. The 10th weapon brings us to something that shaped how Appalachian hunters operated: the knowledge of poisons and toxins derived from plants. This deserves explanation because it sounds sinister, but operated within practical necessity. Certain plants that grew wild in the mountains contained compounds that made game sick or immobilized them temporarily. A hunter might poison a small water source where animals gathered, not to kill them necessarily, but to make them slow enough to approach closely. Or these toxins could be applied to trap mechanisms, ensuring that an animal caught in a snare would die quickly rather than struggle and suffer for hours. This knowledge came from generations of observation, and sometimes, frankly, from trial and error that included mistakes. Mountain herbalists, and nearly every community had someone known for plant knowledge, maintained mental libraries of which plants affected game how. This knowledge wasn't written down, it was oral, transmitted from elder to younger hunter. And if you got it wrong, it either didn't work or worked too well. The distinction between a huntsman with this knowledge and one without could mean the difference between consistent success and constant failure. The ninth weapon on our countdown is something that appears in frontier records repeatedly, but isn't usually discussed in depth: the improvised crossbow. Unlike the elaborate European crossbows of medieval times, these were simpler constructions. A wooden stock, often curved for comfort and stability, fitted with a powerful mechanism for launching a bolt. The tension came from either a wooden sinew system or, later, from metal springs. A skilled craftsman could build one in a few days if he had the materials. Why would a mountain hunter use a crossbow instead of a rifle? Several reasons. Crossbows were silent. They could be reloaded without the physical demands of a heavy rifle. A bolt could be recovered after use. Rifles burn through expensive ammunition. And in certain conditions, particularly in dense undergrowth, where a rifle's long barrel was a liability, a crossbow's compact size was superior. Oral histories from the Appalachian highlands describe outlaws and hunters, sometimes the same person, using crossbows specifically because they were legal to manufacture and carry in many jurisdictions when other weapons weren't. The eighth weapon represents one of the most sophisticated survival tools available to the mountain hunter: the knowledge of animal behavior and psychology. This wasn't just knowing that deer were active at dawn and dusk. This was understanding how animals thought, what scared them, what attracted them, how they communicated with each other. A hunter with this knowledge could manipulate game behavior. He might use a doe call to attract bucks during certain seasons. He might understand that animals following a trail would place their feet in the same spots, allowing him to position himself in absolute stillness along that line of travel. He might recognize the difference between a warning signal from one species and another, allowing him to stay hidden while other hunters crashing through the forest scattered their prey. This knowledge separated legendary hunters from competent ones. A legendary hunter could take game consistently from the same territory where other hunters found nothing. The seventh weapon in our countdown addresses something the reference material touches on, but we're taking in a different direction: the understanding of seasonal timing and migration patterns. Animals didn't just live in the mountains, they moved through them. Elk migrated through certain valleys in early fall. Turkey flocks shifted as mast crops ripened or failed. Fish runs followed predictable patterns in rivers. A family that understood these patterns could position themselves perfectly for abundance. The timing was everything. The wrong time, and hunting was a frustrating waste of effort. The right time, a single day's work might provide meat for weeks. Knowledge of seasonal patterns was so valuable that families would sometimes keep detailed journals, notating when certain animals appeared, when they left, what conditions preceded their arrival. This information became family treasure, passed down and refined across generations. A hunter with accurate seasonal knowledge was essentially a time traveler who already knew where his prey would be. The sixth weapon we're examining is perhaps the most underestimated in survival literature: the ability to move silently and invisibly through difficult terrain. This wasn't just about walking quietly, though that was part of it. It was about understanding how to use landscape features to stay out of an animal's sight. It was about wind direction and how to keep human scent from drifting toward prey. It was about the physics of light and shadow, knowing when moving during bright daylight made you more visible, knowing when twilight or overcast conditions worked in your favor. Young hunters spent years developing this skill. Fathers would take sons hunting and deliberately position them poorly, downwind of game, in exposed positions where they'd fail. The failures taught more than successes. A boy who tried to stalk a deer and ended up with nothing learned exactly what not to do. Repetition built muscle memory. Eventually, a skilled hunter could approach game so closely that ethical hunters would sometimes get within 10 or 15 feet of a deer before taking their shot. This required no weapons other than knowledge and practice. The fifth weapon addresses something central to mountain survival that rarely gets discussed in depth: the knowledge of water systems and how animals use them. Every mountain is carved by water. Creeks, springs, seeps, and underground flows create the landscape. Animals don't live randomly distributed across terrain. They cluster around water. A hunter who understood water systems understood where animals would concentrate. During drought years, when water sources dried up, animals bunched around the remaining wet places. A hunter who knew which springs never failed, which creeks maintained pools even during dry summers, could predict where game would be forced to go. This knowledge, combined with the ability to read tracks around water sources, made a hunter nearly omniscient. Tracks in mud around a water source told stories. Here a large buck had come at dawn. There a doe had brought fawns at midday. That disturbance suggested a predator had approached during the night. A careful observer could learn the complete schedule of every animal in the territory just by visiting water sources regularly and reading what they showed. The fourth weapon in our countdown is something that separates casual hunters from serious ones: the knowledge of how to preserve meat and other foods without relying on refrigeration. Smoking meat over hickory or oak fires created food that would last for months. Salting and drying created jerky that could be carried during hunts. Rendering fat created lard for cooking and lighting. Fermentation and pickling preserved vegetables. A successful hunt meant nothing if you couldn't preserve the results. A family with sophisticated food preservation knowledge could eat well year-round, while a family with poor preservation skills might see their hunt's results spoil before they could be consumed. The skills required to preserve food correctly were technically sophisticated. You had to understand salt ratios: too little and meat spoiled, too much and it became inedible. You had to know how much smoke was beneficial and when smoke began degrading the meat. You had to maintain temperature control in a smokehouse, keeping fires managed so they produced smoke without extreme heat. These weren't simple processes that anyone could manage. They required knowledge and attention to detail. The third weapon we're examining addresses psychological preparation and discipline. Hunting wasn't just about technique. It was about mental toughness. A hunter might spend 3 days in the mountains without taking a shot. He had to maintain focus and readiness the entire time. If he became frustrated or impatient, his effectiveness dropped. Successful mountain hunters developed the ability to be patient beyond what most people today would consider reasonable. They could sit motionless for hours, watching a spot where game might appear. They could return to the same unsuccessful hunting grounds day after day without becoming discouraged. They understood that hunting operated on probabilities. Sometimes you succeeded, sometimes you didn't, and the failures didn't mean you were doing anything wrong. This psychological framework meant that a hunter could sustain pressure over long periods without breaking. He wouldn't take poor shots out of frustration. He wouldn't panic when a deer appeared unexpectedly. He was mentally prepared for most scenarios because he'd experienced them repeatedly. The second weapon on our countdown brings us to perhaps the most important: the firearm itself, but specifically understood not as a tool for violence, but as a precision instrument requiring absolute mastery. The rifles used in Appalachia were typically either muzzleloaders in the early frontier period or later cartridge-fed rifles like the Winchester, Remington, or Springfield models. These weren't point-and-click weapons. They required skill to use effectively. A muzzleloader required the hunter to carry powder, ball, and ramrod. Loading took a minute or more, which meant misses were expensive, both in terms of ammunition and in terms of the animal escaping. Accuracy mattered absolutely. A chest shot on a deer meant quick death. A gut shot meant a wounded animal that suffered and ran, possibly never to be found. The best mountain hunters became extraordinary marksmen, partly through natural talent, but mostly through practice. A man might shoot 50 rounds a month in training. During seasons when he wasn't hunting, he'd shoot at targets at 50 paces, 100 paces, exploring the limits of his weapon's accuracy. This mastery meant that when a hunter took a shot, it counted. Wounded animal rates dropped because the hunter didn't take marginal shots. Efficiency increased because every round fired resulted in an animal. And the psychological benefit was significant. A hunter who knew he could hit what he aimed at had confidence that came across in his bearing and his decision making. The first weapon on our countdown, the primary tool that elevated Appalachian hunters from competent to legendary, was the deep knowledge of the specific territory they hunted. This wasn't general knowledge about how to hunt in mountains. It was intimate, detailed familiarity with one specific area. A legendary hunter might have hunted the same valley or ridgeline for 50 years. He knew every draw where wind funneled in certain directions. He knew which clearings hosted grazing game at dusk. He knew which tree roots tripped careless deer, forcing them to slow and watch their footing. This knowledge wasn't recorded. It lived in his memory, refined by thousands of hours of observation. A stranger could hunt the same territory and fail completely while the local hunter succeeded effortlessly. The stranger didn't have the knowledge. This advantage was so profound that families sometimes kept their best hunting territories as closely guarded secrets, passing them down only to children they were confident would use them responsibly. This concludes part 2. The script continues naturally from the survival weapons countdown and should flow directly into part 3 without a break in narrative continuity. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. A hunter needed the right tools in his hands when the moment came. And one weapon stands out above all others in the stories passed down from those mountain families, the deadfall trap. Not elaborate, not complicated, but devastating in its simplicity and effectiveness. The deadfall was constructed from nothing more than a heavy log positioned above a narrow trigger mechanism. A stick propped at just the right angle held the entire weight in suspension. When an animal pushed the trigger while feeding on bait beneath, the log fell with crushing force. A family could construct 10 of these traps in a day using fallen timber they found in the forest. They required no metal, no forging, no skill beyond understanding animal behavior. Yet they produced consistent kills for centuries before the first manufactured trap ever reached the mountains. What made the deadfall so devastating wasn't force alone. It was reliability. A rifle could misfire. A knife required you to be close enough to strike. But a deadfall worked 24 hours a day in any weather while you attended to other survival tasks. A man could set 50 deadfalls across his hunting territory and check them each morning. By the time he finished his rounds, he might have caught rabbits, groundhogs, and smaller game worth hours of active hunting. But the true genius of mountain trapcraft extended far beyond simple deadfalls. Appalachian hunters developed what outsiders called the treadle trap, a variation where the trigger mechanism was hidden beneath the forest floor itself. The animal never saw what killed it. There was no struggle, no chance of escape. These traps required even greater knowledge of animal trails and behavior. A hunter had to understand where a deer or elk would place its hoof as it walked along a well-worn path. He had to anticipate the precise angle of approach. Then he positioned his trigger directly in that path. The first treadle traps used wooden components entirely. A flatboard pressed down by the animal's weight triggered a spring mechanism made from bent saplings. Later versions incorporated metal springs salvaged from broken machinery. But the principle remained unchanged. Make the animal do the work of its own capture. Let gravity and mechanics handle what violence and strength could not. These trap systems created a profound advantage for families that mastered them. While a man hunted actively with rifle and knife, his wife could check the deadfalls. Older children could maintain the treadle traps. Young boys could gather wood and tend the smoking racks for preserving meat. The entire family operated as a coordinated hunting unit, each member contributing according to their strength and skill. A family that ran 70 or 80 traps across their territory could harvest more game than 10 men hunting actively with rifles. This gave mountain families an enormous survival advantage during harsh winters. A year when winter came early and stayed long, when snow blocked the high passes and hunting became treacherous, the families with well-maintained trap systems ate regularly, while neighboring families faced starvation. Trapcraft wasn't considered a lesser skill than marksmanship. It was valued equally, sometimes more highly. A man who could read animal sign and construct reliable traps had more value to his family than a man who was simply a good shot. Training in trap construction began young. Boys learned to recognize animal sign before they learned to aim a rifle. They learned to read scat and track width, to understand the difference between a doe's trail and a buck's trail, to recognize when an animal had passed recently versus days before. They learned the seasonal patterns, where elk migrated in autumn, where deer gathered in winter, where small game sheltered during spring rains. This knowledge came from direct instruction and countless hours of observation. The deadfall trap itself carried cultural significance beyond its practical function. When a family passed down their best trap locations to the next generation, they were passing down years of accumulated knowledge. They were saying, "This is where I learned to survive. This is what kept my children alive. Now it is your turn to maintain this knowledge and pass it forward." The trap became a symbol of continuity, of tradition, of a family's claim to a particular piece of land. Outsiders often misunderstood the significance of trap systems to mountain culture. They saw traps as primitive tools, something that would eventually be replaced by modern hunting methods and factory-made firearms. But mountain families understood something deeper. Traps worked better than rifles in certain conditions. Traps didn't require ammunition that had to be manufactured and purchased. Traps didn't fail mechanically. Traps worked the same way in 1950 as they had worked in 1750. What made mountain trap craft truly remarkable was its flexibility. A single fundamental design principle, use gravity and mechanics to kill without struggle, could be adapted to catch anything from rabbits to bears. A deadfall designed for a groundhog was simply a smaller version of a deadfall designed for a deer. The logic was identical, only the skill changed. A family that understood this principle could create specialized traps for their specific territory and prey within an afternoon. Some of the most sophisticated trap designs involved water. Appalachian hunters constructed elaborate fish weirs. Partial dams built from stones and branches that guided fish into increasingly narrow channels. Once fish entered these channels, escape became nearly impossible. The hunter returned daily to collect his catch. A well-constructed weir on a productive stream could provide hundreds of pounds of protein during a season. Eel traps used the same principle, but on a smaller scale. A woven basket or cage with a narrow entrance funnel allowed eels to swim in but made exit nearly impossible. These traps hung from bridge pilings or were anchored to the creek bed. A family might run 20 eel traps along a mile of productive stream. Eel meat, though considered an acquired taste by outsiders, was protein-rich and kept well through smoking and drying. But the most ingenious trap designs involved what might be called passive hunting, systems that required no active participation once constructed. A family could create a series of snare lines that circled their territory, running through all the animal highways they had identified. These snares used nothing more than twisted cord or thin sapwood, set at exactly the height an animal's head would be when walking the trail. An animal caught in the snare typically strangled itself through struggle, could be dispatched quickly when discovered. The management of snare lines required constant attention and tremendous knowledge. A family had to check their lines daily, sometimes twice daily if the weather was warm and the meat would spoil quickly. They had to reset snares that had been sprung. They had to rotate their lines, abandoning some trails and focusing on others as animal populations shifted seasonally. This wasn't lazy hunting. This was sophisticated game management practiced with such refinement that professional wildlife biologists would recognize the principles immediately. Records from land office disputes and property surveys from the 1800s reveal something striking. Appalachian families often had far more game preserved on hand than outsiders would have expected. A family of 8 might have 500 to 1,000 pounds of dried meat, fish, and small game in their smokehouse at the onset of winter. This surplus wasn't the result of exceptional hunting luck. It was the result of systematic, carefully managed trap systems that produced reliable harvests month after month. The knowledge required to maintain this level of harvest was never written down in formal documents. It existed only in the minds of the hunters who had practiced it for decades. A boy who grew up checking deadfalls and snare lines learned things that no book could teach him. He learned to move through the forest silently, to notice small details others would miss, to understand the rhythms and patterns of animal life. By the time he was an adult, his knowledge was incomparable to any outsider who arrived with a rifle and general hunting experience. The seasonal nature of trap management added another layer of sophistication. In spring, when small game emerged lean and hungry from winter dens, certain trap placements near food sources became incredibly productive. Summer required different positioning. Game scattered widely to feed on abundant vegetation. Autumn concentrated game in specific areas where mast fell and preparation for winter began. Winter itself required trap modifications because frozen ground became hard as stone, and certain trap mechanisms functioned differently in cold. A hunter who'd practiced trap management for a lifetime could look at the landscape and see the entire network of his traps simultaneously in his mind. He could mentally trace each snare line, remember where each deadfall sat, anticipate which traps would be most productive that particular day based on weather and recent animal movement. This mental map was as detailed as any written survey, but it existed only in his experience and memory. The transition from traditional mountain trap systems to modern factory manufactured hunting methods happened more slowly than most people realize. Even as commercial steel traps became available and affordable in the early 1900s, many Appalachian families maintained their traditional deadfalls and snare systems alongside the new technology. They understood that the newer traps weren't necessarily better, they were just different. A steel trap could rust. A deadfall would function for 100 years if properly maintained. If you want to understand trapcraft at this depth, I've put together a detailed resource that breaks down the specific construction methods and the philosophical approach these families used. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments so you can dig deeper into the mechanics and history. The true legacy of Appalachian trapcraft wasn't simply that it kept families alive through harsh winters. It demonstrated a way of thinking about survival that valued reliability, sustainability, and intimate knowledge of one's environment. Modern hunting culture often emphasizes the skill of the individual hunter with a rifle. Mountain culture emphasized the efficiency of the entire family working as a coordinated unit, using systems designed to produce consistent results regardless of any individual's performance on any given day. This represented a fundamentally different survival philosophy than the frontier hero narrative that dominates American mythology. The solitary rifleman taking down a bull elk doesn't appear in the stories Appalachian families told about their own survival. Instead, they told stories about families that worked intelligently, that planned for the future, that built systems that would outlast any individual member. The trap systems were the physical embodiment of this philosophy. They made a family stronger than any individual could ever be. End of part 3. This continues naturally from part 2 without concluding or adding a final CTA ready for part 4 to follow. When winter came early to the Appalachian ridges, families that had built redundancy into their survival systems didn't panic. They had already harvested the ginseng root crop. They had already dried the meat. They had already set the deadfalls and the snares in the places where deer moved in the cold months. A family with 15 trap lines working across their territory wasn't hoping for a successful hunt. They were almost guaranteed to succeed, regardless of the weather or the season or the whims of individual luck. This is why the greatest survival weapon in Appalachian history wasn't actually a single tool at all. It was the system of knowledge that told you which tools to use, when to use them, and how to combine them into something greater than any individual weapon could achieve alone. A man with a rifle was dangerous. A family with a rifle, 5 trap lines, a spear for the creek, and the knowledge of when each should be deployed, that family would eat when others starved. The outsiders who came to the mountains in the early 20th century documented this with some amazement. They found families living in what they considered poverty, cabins with dirt floors, no electricity, no connection to the modern economy. Yet these families were never actually hungry. They had bread, meat, vegetables, and preserved goods stored away. They had gardens tended with intelligence. They had chickens and pigs and sometimes milk cows. They understood something fundamental about survival that the industrial world had largely forgotten. That security doesn't come from money, but from the ability to produce what you need with your own hands and your own knowledge. The weapons that made this possible weren't exotic. They weren't revolutionary. Most of them are still available today, though many people don't understand how to use them or why they matter. A Green River knife still costs less than a cup of coffee at a chain restaurant. You can buy a good hatchet for under $30. A spear or gig can be made in an afternoon with materials that cost almost nothing. The slingshot that fed Depression-era families is still the most efficient hunting tool ever created, measured by calories returned per minute of effort invested. But here's what's crucial. Owning these tools is completely different from understanding how to use them. This is where the real gap exists between modern Americans and the generations that came before. A contemporary person might buy a trap or a spear without any genuine knowledge of how to set it, how to maintain it, or when and where to deploy it effectively. They own the object, but not the system. They have the hardware without the software. This is why the truly forbidden knowledge isn't actually about the weapons themselves. The government doesn't ban the manufacture of box traps or deadfalls or snares. These tools exist in a legal grey area in most jurisdictions precisely because they're considered obsolete curiosities rather than threats. The real knowledge that was suppressed was the understanding of how to live independently from systems that required money and outside supply chains. Throughout the 20th century, Appalachian families faced persistent pressure to abandon these systems. Schools taught children that modern tools were superior. Government agents sometimes actively discouraged traditional trapping and hunting. Economic forces made it cheaper to buy processed food from a store than to invest the time in hunting and preserving. Gradually, the knowledge began to disappear. Young people moved to cities. The old skills weren't passed down with the same urgency and intention that had characterized previous generations. But something remarkable happened in the last decade of the 20th century and the first years of the 21st. As people in the broader culture started feeling uncertain about the stability of the systems they depended on, they began looking back toward these older methods with renewed interest, not out of nostalgia, but out of practical concern. What happens if the supply chain breaks down? What happens if your money can't buy food? What happens if the skills that kept your ancestors alive suddenly become relevant again? This is where the true continuity of Appalachian survival wisdom emerges. It hasn't actually disappeared, it's been dormant. There are still people in these mountains who know how to set a deadfall properly, who understand the animal pathways well enough to read them, who can judge soil and water quality by sight alone, who remember which plants heal and which poison. These aren't elderly relics waiting to die out. Some are young people who chose to learn from their grandparents before it was too late. The weapons that shaped Appalachian survival tell a deeper story than most history acknowledges. They're a record of intelligent adaptation. They show how communities solved specific problems with available materials. They demonstrate the incredible efficiency that comes from genuine necessity. And they prove that security and abundance don't require complexity. Sometimes they require the opposite. If you're genuinely interested in going deeper into how these systems actually worked, how they were maintained, and most importantly, how they can be adapted and applied in the contemporary world, I've put together a comprehensive resource that breaks down the trap systems, the hunting methodologies, and the philosophical framework that made Appalachian survival so effective. You'll find that resource in the description and pinned in the comments. It's the kind of material that gets deeper than a single video can really go. The final thing worth understanding is this. The weapons that kept Appalachian families alive weren't primarily about killing things. They were about capturing, preserving, and using resources with incredible efficiency. A snare is more efficient than a rifle when your goal is to catch rabbits without wasting ammunition. A fish spear is more effective than a hook and line when you need to feed 10 people and you have limited time. A deadfall works 24 hours a day without your presence or attention. These tools weren't primitive because better tools existed. They were optimal for the specific problems they were designed to solve. Modern survival discourse often emphasizes the glamorous tools, the high-powered rifles, the expensive tactical gear, the latest technology. But the actual history of human survival suggests something different. The most reliable tools are usually simple. The most sustainable systems are built on redundancy and distribution, not on individual capability. The deepest security comes from understanding the specific environment you inhabit and developing tools and techniques specifically suited to that place. This is what made Appalachian survival weapons genuinely dangerous to the mythology of American progress. They proved that you didn't need the industrial system to live well. You didn't need to be dependent on distant factories and complex supply chains. You could build a life of genuine abundance with tools that cost almost nothing and knowledge that you carried in your memory and your hands. That's a dangerous message in a world that profits from dependency. The weapons and tools we've explored in this series represent more than just historical curiosities. They're evidence of a different way of thinking about security, self-sufficiency, and what it actually means to be prepared. In an age where preparedness has become commercialized, where companies sell expensive bunkers and dehydrated meals to anxious consumers, Appalachian approach offers something radically different. It offers knowledge instead of products. It offers systems instead of individual gear. It offers community and continuity instead of isolation and survival instinct. If you want to dive deeper into the actual construction and deployment of these systems, and understand how to adapt them for contemporary use, everything I've referenced is available in the comprehensive resource pinned to this video and linked in the channel description. It covers the historical context, the technical details, and the philosophical framework that made these approaches so effective for so long. The story of Appalachian survival weapons is ultimately a story about people. It's about communities that faced genuine hardship and responded with ingenuity, creativity, and an unwillingness to accept dependency. It's about knowledge systems that were built over centuries and passed down through families with intention and care. And it's about the recognition